Welcome to a gentle exploration of one of the most transformative forces in computing history. Tonight, we drift through the decades that shaped not just Microsoft, but the entire digital landscape we inhabit today. From humble beginnings in a modest garage to becoming the trillion-dollar titan it is now, the story of Microsoft is a story of ambition, innovation, adaptation, and profound influence on how we all interact with technology. Before we can truly understand Microsoft's impact, we must first understand the world that existed before it. The 1960s and 1970s were times of radical transformation in computing. Computers occupied entire rooms, required specialized knowledge to operate, and were primarily the domain of large corporations, government institutions, and universities. They were monuments to human ingenuity, but they were also distant, inaccessible, and utterly foreign to the average person. In the early 1970s, a quiet revolution was beginning to brew. A small group of visionaries began to imagine that computers could be personal, that they could sit on desks in homes and offices, that they could be affordable, that they could transform the way humanity worked, learned, and communicated. This vision seemed almost absurd to the established computer industry at the time. IBM, DEC, Data General, and other giants saw computers as specialized, expensive tools for specialists. The very concept of a personal computer was treated with skepticism, even derision, by many industry professionals. The Altair 8800, released by Emets in 1975, is often credited as the first personal computer. It was crude by modern standards, a beige box with toggle switches and blinking lights, accessible primarily to hobbyists and enthusiasts. But it represented something profound, proof that the vision of personal computing was technically and commercially viable. When the Altair arrived in computer shops and hobbyist gatherings, it sparked something electric in the air. Young programmers and engineers began to imagine what they could build. It was in this moment, as the personal computer was first drawing breath, that Microsoft would be born. But the story actually begins a bit earlier, with two young men who shared a vision that was just a few years ahead of everyone else's. Bill Gates, a Harvard student with an almost obsessive passion for business and technology, and Paul Allen, a talented programmer who was equally convinced that the future belonged to personal computers, first met in Seattle at a private school called Lakeside. The school had acquired a computer terminal connected to a mainframe, and both boys were immediately captivated. Gates was already demonstrating a keen business mind, while Allen was drawn to the technical elegance of programming. The partnership between Gates and Allen was not forged immediately, but rather developed over time as they worked on various small projects together. Gates left Harvard in 1975, a decision that shocked his parents and many of his peers, but which he made with the cold calculation that the personal computer revolution would not wait for him to finish his degree. Allen, working at a company called Honeywell, was consuming every piece of information he could find about the emerging computer industry. When they learned about the Altair 8800, they saw not just a computer, but an opportunity. They saw a problem waiting to be solved, and they positioned themselves to solve it. The software ecosystem for computers in those early days was nearly non-existent. The Altair could be purchased, but it came with almost nothing. No operating system, no programming language, no applications. Users had to write their own code to make the machine do anything useful. This was where Gates and Allen saw their opening. They approached MITS, the Altair's manufacturer, with a proposal. We can provide you with a version of BASIC, a beginner-friendly programming language that will make your computer accessible to far more users. MITS was initially skeptical, but Gates and Allen demonstrated their commitment and their competence. MITS agreed to the deal. On April 4, 1975, Microsoft was officially founded, though the name was not yet finalized. Initially, the company was called Microsoft, with a hyphen derived from microcomputer and software. The hyphen would be dropped in 1981, and Microsoft became the single word we know today. The founding took place in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where MITS was based. Gates was the vice president, and Allen was the executive vice president. The company's first office was sparse, almost Spartan, but it housed the ambitions of two young men who believed they could change the world. The basic language implementation for the Altair was not a trivial achievement. Writing a complete, functional programming language interpreter that could fit into the Altair's limited memory while maintaining usability and speed required exceptional programming skill and deep understanding of hardware constraints. Paul Allen directed the technical work, and while Allen did not personally write all the code, he orchestrated the development effort. The result was Altair Basic, a product that would become the foundation of Microsoft's first success and the template for how the company would operate for decades to come. Identify an emerging technology, understand the market need, and provide the software layer that made that technology accessible and useful. Altair Basic was successful beyond what most observers expected. It became the dominant programming language for early personal computers and began to establish Microsoft as a serious player in an industry that barely existed. But Gates and Allen understood something crucial that many contemporaries did not. The future was not primarily about hardware. It was about software. Hardware companies would proliferate, compete, and eventually consolidate. But software was the interface between human intention and machine capability. Software was where the real value would accumulate. This philosophy would guide every major decision Microsoft made in its early years. While others were focused on the elegance of circuit design or the minimization of transistor counts, Gates and Allen were asking, what software do people actually need? What software barriers exist between people and the tools they want to use? By focusing on software rather than hardware, Microsoft positioned itself to be valuable to any manufacturer, any platform, any configuration of computing hardware. This was not entirely a conscious strategic choice at first, but rather a natural consequence of the company's makeup. They were not hardware engineers. They were software developers. The early years of Microsoft were characterized by aggressive growth and strategic partnerships. Gates and Allen established a business model that would remain core to Microsoft's strategy for decades. Sell operating systems and programming languages to computer manufacturers. By 1978, Microsoft had released BASIC for multiple platforms, and the company was expanding rapidly. Paul Allen, recognizing his own limitations in business operations while Gates thrived in that domain, gradually stepped back from day-to-day management. By 1983, Allen left the company to pursue other interests, though he remained a major shareholder. The departure of Paul Allen marked a subtle but important shift in Microsoft's culture and direction. Gates, now clearly in control, made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential moments in the company's history. Recruit a business manager of exceptional talent. In 1981, Gates hired John Shirley as president, and later brought in Steve Ballmer, Gates's friend from Harvard, who would become Gates's closest business partner and eventually his successor. Ballmer brought a different energy to Microsoft. Where Gates could be reserved and analytical, Ballmer was enthusiastic and driven. The partnership between Gates and Ballmer would define Microsoft's corporate culture for the next 3 decades. The period from 1975 to 1980 saw Microsoft establishing itself as a serious software company, but it was still primarily known among hobbyists and early adopters. The company was successful by startup standards, but it remained relatively small and specialized. This would all change dramatically with one phone call that would reshape not just Microsoft's trajectory, but the entire computer industry. In the late 1970s, IBM was facing a challenge. Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, and other mini-computer manufacturers were eating away at IBM's traditional market. Meanwhile, personal computers were beginning to proliferate, representing what IBM executives viewed as both a threat and an opportunity. IBM, a massive company with a reputation for caution and conservative decision-making, did something unusual. They decided to move quickly and decisively into the personal computer market. They assembled a special task force in Boca Raton, Florida, with a mandate to develop a personal computer and bring it to market within a year. To accomplish this unprecedented feat, IBM made a series of unconventional decisions. Rather than designing everything in-house as IBM had traditionally done, they decided to use industry-standard components and to partner with external software providers. For the operating system, they initially contacted Digital Research, which had created CP/M, a successful operating system for earlier computing systems. The negotiation fell apart due to disagreements about pricing and terms. This failure to connect with Digital Research would prove to be one of the most consequential business miscalculations in computing history. IBM's next call went to Microsoft. Gates and his team saw the opportunity immediately and understood its magnitude. IBM was offering Microsoft the chance to provide the operating system for IBM's personal computer, a machine that would carry the weight of IBM's reputation and marketing power. However, Microsoft did not have an operating system to offer. What Microsoft had was relationships, knowledge of the software industry, and the ability to move quickly. Gates made a decision that demonstrated both his business acumen and his willingness to take calculated risks. Microsoft would license an existing operating system called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, from a small company called Seattle Computer Products, modify it, and present it to IBM as Microsoft DOS. The negotiation with IBM was delicate. IBM wanted to own the DOS software exclusively for their computers, and Microsoft initially agreed to this arrangement. However, Gates negotiated a crucial clause. Microsoft retained the right to sell DOS to other manufacturers under the name MS-DOS. This single clause, easily overlooked by IBM's negotiators, would become the foundation of Microsoft's wealth and dominance. When IBM's personal computer, the IBM PC, launched in August 1981, it was an enormous success. But more importantly, for Microsoft's future, the IBM PC used industry-standard components that other manufacturers could also use. Soon, other companies began building IBM-compatible computers, and they all needed an operating system. Microsoft was ready to supply it. The IBM PC's success changed everything. IBM had legitimized personal computing in the eyes of businesses and the general public. IBM's reputation was so strong that when they released a personal computer, the skepticism that had surrounded earlier personal computers evaporated. Businesses and individuals who had been hesitant about the viability of personal computers suddenly rushed to purchase them. And with every IBM PC sold, and with every IBM-compatible computer that other manufacturers produced, Microsoft was collecting licensing fees. The financial implications of this arrangement became apparent very quickly. By 1983, less than 2 years after the IBM PC's launch, Microsoft was becoming extraordinarily profitable. The company went public in 1986, raising capital and creating significant wealth for its founders and early employees. Gates' net worth began to climb rapidly, eventually making him one of the richest people in the world. But more importantly for the company, the profitability of DOS licensing provided Microsoft with the resources to invest heavily in developing new products and technologies. The DOS operating system, while successful, had significant limitations. It was a command line interface, meaning users had to type obscure commands to accomplish basic tasks. It could access only limited memory. It was single-tasking, and it was, frankly, difficult to use. The graphical user interface existed. Apple had demonstrated its power with the Macintosh, which was released in 1984. But Microsoft did not have an equivalent. This would be an urgent priority for the company. The story of MS-DOS is also a story about Microsoft's strategy regarding intellectual property and business practices that would later become controversial. Microsoft had not developed QDOS from scratch. They had licensed it. The relationship with Seattle Computer Products was straightforward, but would later become a model that critics pointed to when discussing Microsoft's business practices. Some observers noted that Microsoft excelled at identifying valuable software created by others, licensing it, improving it, and then using their market dominance to eventually supersede the original creators. This pattern would repeat throughout Microsoft's history. Microsoft's response to the Macintosh's graphical interface was Windows. The first version of Windows was released in 1985 and was, to be honest, not particularly impressive. It was a graphical shell running on top of MS-DOS, and it was slow, buggy, and lacked the polish of the Macintosh interface. Apple's lawyers took notice and sued Microsoft, claiming that Windows violated Macintosh's visual design patents. The lawsuit would drag on for years, eventually being dismissed. But it signaled the beginning of a long competitive tension between Microsoft and Apple that would define the personal computer industry for the next 3 decades. Despite its shortcomings, Windows represented the direction of the future. Microsoft understood that the graphical user interface was not a passing trend or a luxury feature. It was the inevitable future of personal computing. While Apple focused on controlling both hardware and software, Microsoft focused on becoming the software layer that would run on any hardware. This strategic difference would ultimately prove decisive in determining which company would dominate computing. Windows 2.0, released in 1987, was significantly improved. Windows 3.0, released in 1990, was the breakthrough moment. Windows 3.0 was fast enough, stable enough, and user-friendly enough that ordinary people could use computers without specialized training. It became phenomenally successful, driving hardware sales and creating an ecosystem of software developers who built applications for Windows. The success of Windows 3.0 marked the moment when Microsoft shifted from being a software supplier to computer manufacturers to being a technology company in its own right, with direct consumer influence and impact. The early 1990s saw Microsoft consolidating its dominance in personal computing. Windows continued to improve with each release. Windows 3.1, Windows 95, Windows 98. Each iteration addressed limitations of the previous version, added new capabilities, and further cemented Microsoft's position as the dominant operating system for personal computers. During this period, Microsoft also introduced Office, a suite of productivity applications including Word, a word processor, Excel, a spreadsheet, and PowerPoint, a presentation tool. Office would become another pillar of Microsoft's business, eventually generating revenues comparable to Windows itself. The relationship between Windows and Office demonstrated an important strategy in Microsoft's playbook: vertical integration and ecosystem lock-in. Windows made certain programming interfaces available to Microsoft's application developers that were not available to competitors or were available on unfavorable terms. This gave Microsoft's own applications advantages in performance and functionality. Office, conversely, was optimized for Windows and encouraged users to upgrade to the latest version of Windows to get the best Office experience. This virtuous cycle of mutual reinforcement created powerful incentives for users and businesses to stay within the Microsoft ecosystem. The rise of the Internet in the mid-1990s presented Microsoft with a challenge that required immediate attention. Initially, Microsoft was somewhat caught off guard by the explosive growth of the World Wide Web and the Internet's migration from academic institutions to mainstream consciousness. The company's initial offerings were tentative and behind the curve. Netscape Navigator, developed by a company founded by Mark Andreessen and the team that created the original Mosaic browser, emerged as the dominant web browser in the early days of the commercial Internet. However, Microsoft, while late to the game, was not about to cede the Internet to competitors. The company understood that whoever controlled the browser through which people accessed the Internet controlled a crucial gateway to information and services. Browser technology was becoming as important as the operating system itself. Microsoft's response was swift and aggressive. Internet Explorer, first released in 1995 as part of Windows 95. Internet Explorer was positioned not as a separate application, but as an integrated part of the operating system itself. This integration strategy was controversial then, and remains controversial today. Internet Explorer itself was not initially superior to Netscape Navigator in terms of features or performance. What made Internet Explorer powerful was its integration with Windows. It came installed on every new computer running Windows, which by the mid-1990s was the vast majority of personal computers sold. This default positioning gave Internet Explorer an enormous advantage. Users often did not even consider downloading Netscape Navigator because the browser they needed was already there, already installed, already integrated into their experience of Windows. Microsoft's tactics in the browser wars extended beyond merely including Internet Explorer with Windows. The company also made deals with computer manufacturers to bundle Internet Explorer on their systems and to make it difficult to remove or replace. They also employed several technical strategies, such as implementing proprietary extensions to web standards that worked well in Internet Explorer, but poorly in competing browsers. This fragmented the web development ecosystem and forced many web developers to optimize specifically for Internet Explorer, which further entrenched its market dominance. Netscape fought back, but they were ultimately fighting against the gravity of an integrated operating system. By the late 1990s, Internet Explorer had captured the dominant share of the browser market, reaching peaks of over 95% market share in the early 2000s. Netscape's parent company, America Online, eventually shut down the Netscape browser development, and the company's assets were acquired by other firms. The browser wars of the 1990s demonstrated Microsoft's market power, but also represented the beginning of regulatory scrutiny of the company's business practices. The United States Department of Justice filed an antitrust suit against Microsoft in 1998, arguing that the company was engaging in anti-competitive behavior by bundling Internet Explorer with Windows and using its operating system dominance to extend market share into the browser market. The case, United States versus Microsoft, became one of the most significant antitrust cases of the modern era. The trial revealed extensive evidence of Microsoft's aggressive business tactics, internal emails showing strategic intent, and a business model that critics argued prioritized market dominance over innovation and consumer benefit. The case dragged on for years, with various rulings and appeals. Initially, Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson ruled that Microsoft had engaged in anti-competitive behavior and should be broken apart into separate companies. However, this ruling was eventually overturned on appeal, and Microsoft eventually settled the case with the Department of Justice in 2001. The settlement required Microsoft to share certain application programming interfaces with competitors and to modify some of its bundling practices. But it stopped short of the more drastic remedies that had been initially proposed. For Microsoft, the case was a significant moment in its corporate history, a moment when the company's power was publicly challenged and scrutinized, and when the line between aggressive business strategy and anti-competitive behavior became a matter of intense public debate. Beyond the browser wars, Microsoft continued to expand its business during the 1990s. The company released Windows NT in 1993, targeting enterprise customers and servers. Windows NT was fundamentally different from the consumer versions of Windows. It was a 32-bit operating system designed for stability, security, and multi-user networking. Windows NT established Microsoft as a player in the enterprise and server markets, areas traditionally dominated by Unix-based systems from companies like Sun Microsystems, Digital Equipment Corporation, and others. The success of Windows NT proved that Microsoft could compete effectively in the enterprise market, not just the consumer market. Combined with Microsoft Office, which was becoming the dominant productivity suite in business environments, Microsoft was positioning itself as a company that could supply not just personal computers, but entire infrastructure and software stacks for organizations. This diversification was crucial because it reduced Microsoft's dependence on the consumer PC market and created new revenue streams from enterprise licensing and support. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, Microsoft also invested heavily in developer tools and platforms. Visual Studio, released in various forms beginning in 1997, became the dominant integrated development environment for Windows application development. The .NET Framework, first announced in 2000 and released in 2002, provided a unified platform for developing applications in multiple programming languages. These developer-focused products were strategically important because they created network effects. As more developers learned and used Microsoft's tools, more applications were built for Microsoft's platforms, which increased the value of those platforms to end users. The .NET Framework represented an important evolution in Microsoft's strategic thinking. Rather than simply providing an operating system and office productivity tools, Microsoft was now positioning itself as a complete platform for application development. The .NET Framework abstracted away many of the complexities of operating system programming and provided a unified runtime environment in which multiple programming languages could run. This was innovative in that it democratized some of the complexity of systems programming and made it easier for developers to focus on application logic rather than low-level system details. CE, a programming language developed by Microsoft specifically for the .NET Framework and designed by Anders Hejlsberg, became an important part of the .NET ecosystem. CE was influenced by Java, developed by Sun Microsystems, but was designed specifically to leverage the capabilities of the .NET runtime. The design of Series demonstrated Microsoft's ability to learn from and improve upon ideas developed elsewhere, adapting them to its own strategic needs. The language became popular among developers, particularly those building enterprise applications for Windows and web applications running on Windows servers. The .NET Framework's success in the enterprise market was substantial but not complete. Java, developed by Sun Microsystems and designed to run on any platform with a Java runtime, remained extremely popular, particularly in large enterprise environments. The enterprise software market was diverse and complex enough to support multiple platforms and frameworks. However, Microsoft's .NET Framework captured a significant portion of the enterprise development market, particularly in organizations that were already deep in the Microsoft ecosystem, with Windows servers, SQL Server databases, and Office-using workforces. SQL Server, Microsoft's relational database product, became another pillar of Microsoft's enterprise business. Database software had traditionally been dominated by Oracle, a company that was founded in 1977 and had established itself as the leading enterprise database vendor. However, SQL Server offered a more affordable alternative to Oracle and integrated well with other Microsoft products. Organizations could build entire technology stacks using Microsoft products, Windows or Windows Server for operating systems, SQL Server for databases, .NET for application development, and Windows desktops with Office for end users. This complete stack approach gave organizations a coherent, integrated set of tools and reduced the complexity of managing multiple vendors' products. The 2000s represented the peak of Microsoft's dominance in computing. The company's market capitalization reached historic highs, and its influence over the computing industry seemed almost absolute. Personal computers running Windows dominated the consumer market. Office productivity software was the standard in business environments. Enterprise infrastructure increasingly relied on Microsoft products, The company's stock was a darling of investors, and the company's founders, Gates and Ballmer, became among the richest people in the world. However, this dominance also contained the seeds of future challenges. The personal computer market, while still growing, was maturing. The growth rates that had characterized the personal computer industry from the 1970s through the 1990s began to slow. Market saturation in developed countries meant that computers were increasingly replacement purchases rather than new market entrants. Additionally, new technologies were emerging that would challenge Microsoft's dominance and eventually force the company to adapt and evolve in fundamental ways. The personal computer market's maturation was not immediately apparent in Microsoft's financial results, which remained strong through the 2000s. However, looking back from a modern perspective, the seeds of future disruption were already sown. The Internet, which Microsoft had adapted to and eventually dominated through Internet Explorer, would continue to evolve. Mobile computing, which barely existed in Microsoft's strategic consciousness in 2000, would become increasingly important. Cloud computing, a concept that would not gain widespread recognition until the late 2000s, would eventually reshape how software was developed, deployed, and consumed. The rise of mobile computing in the 2000s represented one of the most significant challenges to Microsoft's dominance in its entire history. When Apple released the iPhone in 2007, it fundamentally changed how people thought about personal computing. The iPhone was not marketed as a personal computer, but rather as a mobile device that combined phone, music player, and internet communication device. It was elegant, intuitive, and represented a radical departure from the Windows-based computing paradigm that had dominated for 20 years. Microsoft's response to mobile computing was hesitant and ultimately unsuccessful. The company had developed Windows Mobile, an operating system designed for smartphones and tablets, but it struggled to achieve significant market traction. Windows Mobile was criticized for being slow, unstable, and not intuitive for touch-based interfaces. More problematically, Windows Mobile lacked the ecosystem of applications that would make it appealing to users. Apple's App Store, launched in 2008, created a compelling marketplace for applications on the iPhone. Google's Android, released in 2008 as well, benefited from being open source and customizable by multiple manufacturers. Microsoft's Windows Phone, released in 2010, was actually a well-designed operating system with an innovative interface paradigm called Metro, which used large, colorful tiles rather than application icons. However, despite positive reviews from technology critics, Windows Phone failed to gain significant market share. By the time Windows Phone launched, the iPhone and Android phones had already captured most of the market, and consumers had developed preferences and habits around those platforms. Additionally, Windows Phone suffered from a lack of compelling applications and a fragmented ecosystem of manufacturers. The failure of Windows Phone represented a significant strategic defeat for Microsoft. For the first time in decades, Microsoft was not able to leverage its dominance in one market, personal computers, to establish dominance in an adjacent market, mobile devices. This failure had profound implications for Microsoft's future. As mobile devices became increasingly important, first for personal communication and entertainment, later for business and productivity, Microsoft's absence from the mobile space meant that a significant portion of computing was happening on platforms that Microsoft did not control. In 2013, Microsoft made a strategic pivot. Bill Gates, who had stepped down as CEO in 2000, officially left the company to focus on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Steve Ballmer, who had been CEO since 2000, announced that he would step down. The search for a new CEO was significant because it represented an opportunity to reset the company's direction and culture. After considering various candidates, Microsoft's board selected Satya Nadella, who had been leading the company's cloud computing division, Azure. Satya Nadella's appointment marked a turning point in Microsoft's history. Nadella came to Microsoft from Hyderabad, India, and brought with him a different perspective on technology and business. Unlike Gates, who was known for his competitive intensity, and Ballmer, who was known for his evangelical enthusiasm for Windows and dominance, Nadella emphasized collaboration, openness, and a willingness to embrace technologies and platforms that existed outside Microsoft's traditional ecosystem. Perhaps most importantly, Nadella recognized that Microsoft's future was not primarily in personal computers or even operating systems, but in cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and services. The shift under Nadella's leadership was not immediate or dramatic. Rather, it was a gradual but deliberate reorientation of the company's strategy and culture. Nadella began to emphasize that Microsoft was a cloud and artificial intelligence company, and that the company's mission was to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. This mission statement was subtly different from the earlier Microsoft focus on operating system and software dominance. It suggested that Microsoft would achieve its goals not by controlling what software people used, but by providing services and tools that enhanced human capability. One of Nadella's early strategic decisions was to embrace open-source software, a move that would have been almost unthinkable under Gates or Ballmer. Open-source software, such as Linux, had been positioned as a competitor and threat to Microsoft throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Gates himself had been skeptical of open-source software, famously comparing it to a cancer due to its intellectual property implications. However, Nadella recognized that open-source software was becoming increasingly important in enterprise development, and that Microsoft could benefit from actively participating in the open-source ecosystem rather than fighting against it. Microsoft began contributing to open-source projects, releasing some of its own technologies as open source, and collaborating with the open source community. This was a cultural shift that signaled a new era at Microsoft. The company also began to de-emphasize the importance of Windows as its core product, and to reposition Windows as simply another offering in a diverse portfolio of platforms and services. Microsoft even released versions of SQL Server and other enterprise products for Linux, the open-source operating system that had been seen as an existential threat to Microsoft a decade earlier. Another crucial strategic move under Nadella was the acquisition of Minecraft in 2014 for approximately $2.5 billion. Minecraft is a sandbox video game that had been created by an independent developer and had become a cultural phenomenon, particularly among young people. The acquisition seemed unusual for a company focused on enterprise software, but it reflected Nadella's broader vision. Microsoft needed to be present in emerging technologies and platforms, including entertainment and consumer-facing services. Minecraft also represented an opportunity for Microsoft to establish a presence on mobile platforms where its own efforts had failed. The acquisition of LinkedIn in 2016 for approximately $26 billion was another significant move that signaled Nadella's strategic thinking. LinkedIn is a social network focused on professional connections and career development. The acquisition was surprising to some observers but made strategic sense. LinkedIn represented a massive database of professional relationships and career data. Integrated with Microsoft's other services, LinkedIn could provide insights and connectivity to Microsoft's enterprise customers. The acquisition also demonstrated that Microsoft was willing to invest large sums of capital in growth opportunities, particularly in areas where the company lacked existing dominance. GitHub, a platform for software development and version control that had become essential infrastructure for modern software development, was acquired by Microsoft in 2018 for approximately $7.5 billion. This acquisition was particularly significant because GitHub was deeply embedded in the open-source software community, an area where Microsoft had been an outsider and often an antagonist. The acquisition signaled Microsoft's commitment to embracing open-source development as central to its future strategy. Since the acquisition, Microsoft has integrated GitHub with its own development tools and services, while maintaining GitHub's independence and commitment to serving the entire software development community. These acquisitions, Minecraft, LinkedIn, and GitHub, along with many others, reflected a fundamental shift in Microsoft's business model. Rather than primarily developing products internally and dominating through operating system control, Microsoft was increasingly becoming an acquisition-driven company that integrated various platforms and services into a broader ecosystem. This strategy was not entirely new. Microsoft had acquired many companies throughout its history, but the pace and scale of acquisitions under Nadella increased dramatically. The company was essentially using its massive cash reserves to acquire its way into new markets and technologies. The most important strategic move under Nadella's leadership, however, was the aggressive push of Azure, Microsoft's cloud computing platform. Cloud computing represents a fundamental shift in how software is delivered and consumed. Rather than installing software on personal computers or servers, cloud computing delivers software as a service through the Internet. Users access applications and store data in remote data centers operated by the cloud provider. For Microsoft, which had built its dominance on selling software licenses, cloud computing represented both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was that cloud computing potentially made the operating system less important. If users were primarily accessing cloud-based applications through a web browser, it mattered less whether their personal computer was running Windows or another operating system. The opportunity was that Microsoft could become a provider of cloud infrastructure and services, a market that was growing explosively. Amazon Web Services, launched by Amazon in 2006, had already established itself as the dominant cloud computing provider by the time Nadella became CEO. Azure was Microsoft's response, and it was a response that required significant investment, strategic patience, and cultural change. Azure was not new when Nadella became CEO. It had been launched in 2010, but it had not been the company's strategic priority under Ballmer. Azure was still very much behind Amazon Web Services in market share and functionality. However, Nadella and his leadership team recognized that cloud computing was the future and that Microsoft needed to be a leader, not a follower, in this space. The company invested heavily in Azure, continuously improving its capabilities, expanding its data center footprint around the world, and building integrations with Microsoft's existing products like Office, Dynamics, and Windows Server. The strategy was to offer customers an integrated ecosystem. They could migrate their existing Windows Server, SQL Server, and Office workloads to Azure. They could develop new applications using .NET on Azure. They could integrate their enterprise data with Microsoft's artificial intelligence and analytics services. This vertical integration approach was familiar to Microsoft. It was similar to how the company had achieved dominance in personal computing, but applied to the cloud. The difference was that in the cloud market, Microsoft was not the dominant player trying to maintain its position, but rather a challenger trying to gain share from Amazon and other competitors. By the early 2020s, Azure had become Microsoft's second largest business by revenue after Office and Windows. The growth of Azure represented a fundamental transformation of Microsoft's business model. The company was shifting from selling software licenses to business customers and operating systems to personal computer manufacturers towards selling cloud services on a consumption basis. This shift had important implications for how Microsoft's business worked. Rather than one-time software license sales, cloud services generate recurring revenue. Rather than customers making large capital expenditures on software licenses, they make ongoing operational expenditures, only paying for what they use. The cloud strategy also positioned Microsoft to benefit from emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. These technologies require massive computational resources, which cloud providers can offer at scale. Microsoft began to offer AI and machine learning services through Azure, including computer vision, natural language processing, and predictive analytics. This allowed customers who did not have their own massive data science teams to still benefit from advanced AI technologies. The partnership between Microsoft and OpenAI, the company that created ChatGPT, represented another important step in Microsoft's AI strategy. Microsoft had invested billions in OpenAI and integrated OpenAI's technology into its own products. By 2023, Microsoft was integrating ChatGPT and other large language models into Bing, Office, and Azure services. This positioned Microsoft to capture value from the explosive growth of generative AI, an area that many industry observers believe will be as transformative as the personal computer or the internet. The integration of artificial intelligence into Microsoft's core products and services represents perhaps the most significant strategic emphasis since Nadella's appointment as CEO. Generative AI, specifically large language models like GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer, has captured global attention and imagination. Microsoft recognized early that this technology could be transformative across its entire product portfolio. Rather than developing its own large language models from scratch, Microsoft made the strategic decision to partner deeply with OpenAI, a relationship that has involved significant financial investment and technological collaboration. In January 2023, Microsoft announced that it was integrating ChatGPT, OpenAI's most famous product, into its own services. Bing, Microsoft's search engine that had struggled to gain market share against Google for over a decade was updated with a new AI-powered chat interface. Microsoft also began rolling out Copilot, an AI-powered assistant based on large language models, into Office applications including Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook. These integrations were designed to enhance productivity by automating routine tasks, generating content, summarizing information, and providing intelligent suggestions based on what users were trying to accomplish. The pivot to AI-powered services represented a fundamental change in how Microsoft was positioning itself in the computing industry. For most of Microsoft's history, the company competed on the basis of having the most capable software features and the most stable, reliable infrastructure. Now, Microsoft was competing on the basis of having access to the most advanced artificial intelligence. The company's advantages: massive computational resources through Azure, access to OpenAI's technology, and the ability to integrate AI into familiar products like Office and Outlook, positioned Microsoft to potentially capture significant value from the AI revolution. However, the AI integration strategy also introduced new uncertainties and risks. Generative AI systems are not perfectly predictable. They can make mistakes, hallucinate facts, or produce biased or inappropriate outputs. Integrating these systems into products that millions of people rely on for their work introduces potential problems. Additionally, the regulatory landscape around AI is still developing, with governments around the world considering how to regulate AI systems responsibly. Microsoft's aggressive integration of AI into its products signaled confidence in the technology, but also exposed the company to potential regulatory backlash or product failures if AI systems cause problems. Beyond strategic shifts in products and technologies, Nadella's leadership has also involved significant cultural transformation at Microsoft. The company's culture under Gates and Ballmer had been characterized by intense competition and a winner-take-all mentality. Ballmer himself was known for his competitive fire and his embrace, extend, extinguish strategy for dealing with competitors and open standards. Stories circulated about the intensity of internal debates at Microsoft, where smart people competed vigorously for resources and influence. Nadella has worked to transform Microsoft's culture toward one that emphasizes learning, collaboration, and what he calls a growth mindset. This concept, borrowed from educational psychology research, emphasizes that abilities and intelligence are not fixed, but can be developed through effort. Applied to organizational culture, this means encouraging employees to take risks, learn from failures, and collaborate rather than compete internally. Nadella has also emphasized that diversity, equity, and inclusion are important not just as moral imperatives, but as business strategies that lead to better products and innovation. This cultural shift has not been without challenges and critics. Some long-term Microsoft employees and observers have argued that the company's competitive intensity was part of what made it successful, and that a move toward greater collaboration and learning could soften the company's competitive edge. Others have questioned whether the cultural changes are genuine transformations or merely surface-level rebranding. Nevertheless, the effort to shift Microsoft's culture has been a notable feature of the Nadella era and represents a different approach to organizational leadership than previous Microsoft CEOs. The company's approach to diversity and inclusion has also evolved significantly. Microsoft, like the technology industry more broadly, has historically been dominated by men, and particularly by white men. The company has made public commitments to increasing the representation of women and minorities, particularly in technical and leadership roles. These efforts have been reflected in hiring practices, promotion policies, and the composition of the company's leadership team. While progress has been gradual and ongoing challenges remain, the company's public commitment to diversity represents a shift in priorities from previous eras. In 2019, Microsoft's market capitalization crossed $1 trillion, making it one of only a few companies in history to reach that milestone. This achievement reflected not just the company's history of success, but also investor confidence in its strategic direction under Nadella. The trillion-dollar valuation came after a dramatic stock price recovery. During the mid-2010s, Microsoft's stock price had been relatively flat, reflecting uncertainty about the company's strategic direction and growth prospects. However, as Azure's success became apparent and Nadella's strategy began to bear fruit, investor sentiment shifted dramatically. The composition of Microsoft's business revenue had shifted substantially by the time the company reached the trillion-dollar milestone. While Windows and Office remained important revenue sources, they were no longer the dominant drivers of growth. Azure and other cloud services were growing much faster than the traditional software licensing business. Additionally, LinkedIn, which Microsoft had acquired in 2016, was generating substantial revenue. The company's gaming division, enhanced by the acquisition of Minecraft and strengthened by its commitment to Game Pass, a subscription service for games, was also contributing meaningfully to revenues. This diversification represented a significant transformation of Microsoft's business model from what it had been during the Gates and Ballmer eras. Microsoft was no longer primarily a software company, selling licenses to enterprises and individuals. Instead, it was becoming a diversified technology company with revenue from cloud services, subscriptions, advertising, gaming, and various other sources. This diversification had both strategic advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it reduced Microsoft's dependence on any single product or market, lowering risk. On the other hand, the company was now competing in more markets and facing more competitors than ever before. The pursuit of Activision Blizzard in 2022 represented one of the largest acquisitions in Microsoft's history. Microsoft agreed to purchase Activision Blizzard for approximately $69 billion, making it the most expensive acquisition in the technology industry at that time. The acquisition was motivated by Microsoft's desire to strengthen its gaming business and to ensure access to Activision Blizzard's massive library of popular game franchises, including Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, and Candy Crush. The acquisition also reflected Microsoft's strategic interest in the metaverse, the hypothetical future iteration of the Internet, where people interact in virtual spaces, and in the intellectual property that would be valuable in such environments. The Activision acquisition was not without controversy. Activision Blizzard had faced numerous allegations of workplace harassment and toxic workplace culture, particularly against women and underrepresented minorities. Some observers questioned whether Microsoft should acquire the company given these issues. However, Microsoft proceeded with the acquisition after implementing plans to address workplace culture and conduct at Activision Blizzard. The company also faced regulatory scrutiny, particularly from the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, which initially blocked the deal, citing concerns about market competition in cloud gaming. The deal eventually closed in October 2023, after Microsoft addressed regulatory concerns. Looking at Microsoft in the mid-2020s, the company has successfully transformed from a personal computer and software licensing company into a diversified technology corporation with major businesses in cloud computing, productivity software, gaming, professional networking, and artificial intelligence. The company faces competition from various sources: Amazon in cloud computing, Google in search and productivity software, Meta and TikTok in social media and digital advertising, and various game publishers in gaming. However, Microsoft's diversified portfolio, substantial financial resources, and investments in emerging technologies like AI position it as one of the most powerful technology companies in the world. The transformation under Nadella has been significant, but also incomplete. Microsoft remains in many ways a company built on the foundations laid by Gates and Ballmer: a respect for software engineering excellence, a focus on enterprise customers, a willingness to pursue aggressive business strategies, and a commitment to developing products that solve real problems. However, the emphasis on cloud computing, artificial intelligence, open-source software, collaboration, and diversity represents a genuine shift from previous eras. Whether this transformation will prove successful in the long term remains to be seen. But it demonstrates that even companies with a history of dominance can adapt and evolve when faced with changing markets and technologies. To understand Microsoft's true legacy, we must step back and consider how thoroughly the company has shaped computing and, by extension, modern society. For several decades, Microsoft's software was not just one option among many for how computers could work. It was the dominant standard. The vast majority of personal computers sold globally ran Windows. The vast majority of office workers used Office productivity software. This dominance had profound implications for technology development, business practices, and individual lives. From a technology perspective, Microsoft's dominance established certain patterns and conventions in computing that persist today. The personal computer model, a computing device owned by an individual, running a graphical operating system with applications installed locally, was not invented by Microsoft, but Microsoft's execution and dominance established this as the dominant paradigm for several decades. The separation between operating system and applications, the file-based storage model, the window-based interface, the mouse and keyboard interaction model, all of these became standard because Microsoft implemented them effectively and achieved massive market adoption. From a business perspective, Microsoft demonstrated how a software company could build enormous value and market power. Software itself was intangible and infinitely reproducible. Yet Microsoft showed that software could be the basis for a trillion-dollar company. The business model of selling software licenses to enterprises and individuals, while protecting intellectual property through patents and copyrights, became the template that many other technology companies followed. This model has generated enormous wealth for software companies and their founders, fundamentally reshaping the technology industry and the distribution of wealth in society. Microsoft's dominance also meant that the company had significant influence over the pace and direction of technological innovation. The company's focus on backward compatibility, ensuring that new versions of Windows could run old applications, meant that the computing industry moved forward in a somewhat conservative manner. New technologies were often slower to be adopted if they broke compatibility with existing Windows applications. This conservatism had benefits. It made the computing industry more stable and predictable, but it also meant that Windows was sometimes seen as a constraint on innovation rather than an enabler of it. The browser wars and the integration of Internet Explorer with Windows provide perhaps the clearest example of how Microsoft's dominance could shape the entire computing industry. By making Internet Explorer the default browser on every Windows computer sold, Microsoft essentially determined what most people's first experience with the web would be. Web developers optimized for Internet Explorer because that's what most users had. This gave Microsoft enormous influence over web standards and web development practices. When Internet Explorer began to be abandoned by users after the rise of Firefox and Chrome, the web development community's frustration with Internet Explorer's limitations became legendary. Some observers argued that Internet Explorer's dominance had actually slowed the pace of web innovation. The antitrust cases against Microsoft, both in the United States and in Europe, represented an important moment when society questioned whether Microsoft's market power had crossed the line from acceptable competitive advantage into anti-competitive behavior. The outcomes of these cases established precedents about what practices are acceptable for dominant companies and what practices constitute abuse of market power. The cases also highlighted the challenges of regulating technology companies. By the time regulators could obtain evidence of anti-competitive practices and bring cases to trial, the market had often already moved on to new technologies and new competitors. Microsoft's dominance in enterprise software and infrastructure, while less visible to consumers than its dominance in personal computers was, may prove to be even more durable and profitable in the long term. Enterprise customers are generally risk-averse and reluctant to migrate away from established systems. The switching costs, the expense and disruption of moving from one software platform to another, are enormous in enterprise environments. The lock-in effect, where customers become so dependent on a particular software ecosystem that switching becomes prohibitively expensive, is particularly powerful in enterprise settings. This enterprise dominance has protected Microsoft from the fate that befell other dominant technology companies. While personal computer makers like Dell and Hewlett-Packard saw their market dominance eroded by competition from cheaper manufacturers and by the shift to mobile computing, Microsoft's enterprise business has remained fundamentally stable and profitable. Even as the personal computer market declined in relative importance, Microsoft's enterprise cloud services, infrastructure products, and software licensing relationships continued to generate substantial revenue. This stability provides Microsoft with financial resources to invest in new technologies and to weather disruptions. However, Microsoft faces significant challenges in the modern computing environment. The company is no longer the unquestioned technology leader in the way it was during the peak of the personal computer era. Google has established dominance in search and advertising. Apple has established a powerful ecosystem in mobile devices and consumer electronics. Amazon has established dominance in cloud computing, which is arguably the most important technology infrastructure of the modern era. Microsoft competes with all of these companies and, in some cases, competes from a position of relative weakness despite its enormous size and resources. The rise of artificial intelligence presents both opportunities and challenges for Microsoft. The opportunities are substantial. Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI, its integration of AI into its products, and its cloud computing resources position the company to capture significant value from the AI revolution. However, artificial intelligence also represents a potential disruption to Microsoft's core business model. If software development and deployment become increasingly dominated by AI, this could reduce the economic value of traditional software and platform companies. If artificial intelligence systems become ubiquitous and commodified, competition in technology could increase rather than remain concentrated. The leadership transitions at Microsoft have been as significant as any strategic decision in charting the company's course. Bill Gates, the technical visionary and competitive founder, established the company's fundamental orientation toward software dominance. Gates' leadership style was characterized by intense intellectual debate, high standards for analytical rigor, and a willingness to engage deeply with technical details, even as the company grew very large. The famous Bill Reviews, where Gates would examine presentations and proposals with demanding questions, became legendary within the company. Steve Ballmer, Gates' close friend and the business-focused president, and later CEO, brought a different energy to Microsoft. Ballmer's leadership style was enthusiastic, evangelical, and intensely focused on achieving market dominance through aggressive competitive tactics. Under Ballmer, Microsoft pursued a strategy of pursuing dominance in multiple markets simultaneously: operating systems, productivity software, development tools, enterprise software, gaming, and various other domains. Ballmer's energy and intensity drove the company forward, but also contributed to a culture that was sometimes perceived as an internally fractious and externally aggressive. Satya Nadella's appointment as CEO represented a significant departure from the Gates and Ballmer eras. Nadella's background was different. He came to Microsoft from Hyderabad, India, and did not have the deep history with the company that Gates and Ballmer had. His leadership style emphasized learning, collaboration, and openness to ideas from outside the company. Under Nadella, Microsoft has been willing to embrace open-source software, to partner with competitors, and to invest in technologies and platforms that exist outside Microsoft's traditional ecosystem. This represents a fundamentally different approach to competition and strategy than previous eras. The influence of leadership style on corporate culture and strategy cannot be overstated. Microsoft under Gates was a company focused on building the best software and establishing monopolistic dominance. Microsoft under Ballmer was a company focused on aggressive competitive tactics and pursuing dominance across multiple markets. Microsoft under Nadella is a company focused on providing cloud-based services and AI-powered tools to enterprises and individuals. Each of these strategic orientations reflected the leadership's values and approach to business. The transitions between leaders, while sometimes disruptive, have also allowed Microsoft to adapt to changing market conditions and technologies. As we look toward the future, Microsoft faces both extraordinary opportunities and significant challenges. The company's diversified portfolio, cloud computing, productivity software, gaming, professional networking, artificial intelligence, positions it as a major player across multiple domains. The company's financial resources are enormous, exceeding $200 billion in annual revenue and hundreds of billions in cash. The company's technical talent, acquired through both internal hiring and acquisitions, is substantial. These factors suggest that Microsoft will remain one of the most important technology companies in the world. However, Microsoft also faces significant headwinds. Cloud computing, while growing, is becoming increasingly competitive and commodity-like. The margins on cloud services are under pressure from competition and from the massive capital investments required to operate global data center networks. Productivity software is facing disruption from cloud-based alternatives and from artificial intelligence. The personal computer market, while still significant, is no longer the engine of growth it once was. Microsoft's future earnings growth will depend on its ability to establish new sources of competitive advantage and revenue in emerging technologies. The company's pivot to artificial intelligence represents an attempt to establish new sources of competitive advantage in an emerging domain. If Microsoft can successfully integrate advanced AI capabilities into its products and establish leadership in AI-powered enterprise software, this could sustain the company's growth for the next decade or more. However, this outcome is not guaranteed. Other companies, including Google, Amazon, and various AI startups, are also pursuing AI leadership. The AI market is nascent, and the winners are not yet determined. Throughout its history, Microsoft has demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt and evolve when faced with changing technologies and markets. The company that dominated the personal computer era successfully transitioned to the Internet era, adapted to the mobile era, and is now attempting to position itself as an AI leader. This adaptability suggests that Microsoft will likely remain a significant force in technology for decades to come. However, the company's continued success is not assured. The technology industry is characterized by rapid change and disruption, and even very large, very successful companies can lose dominance if they fail to adapt appropriately to market changes. The story of Microsoft is fundamentally a story of American capitalism and the technology industry in the modern era. It is a story of ambitious young people with a vision, willing to work intensely and to take calculated risks. It is a story of how software, initially undervalued and underestimated, became the basis for extraordinary wealth and power. It is also a story of how market dominance, while providing enormous advantages, can also create complacency and resistance to change. Microsoft's evolution from a personal computer software company to a diversified technology corporation reflect both the opportunities available to companies that adapt successfully and the challenges faced by even the most successful companies in a rapidly changing industry. As the world continues to change, driven by artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and technologies we cannot yet predict, Microsoft's ability to adapt and innovate will be tested repeatedly. The company that emerges from these challenges may be very different from the Microsoft of today. Just as today's Microsoft is very different from the company that shipped MS-DOS in 1981. Yet the fundamentals that Gates and Allen established, the focus on software, the partnership approach to hardware manufacturers, and the willingness to compete aggressively in markets where the company identifies opportunity, remain relevant even now, providing a foundation upon which future growth can be built. The quiet night extends its peace to us now. After this long journey through the history of technology and human ambition, we have drifted through 5 decades of innovation, competition, triumph, and adaptation. We have seen how a small software company grew into one of the most powerful corporations in human history. We have witnessed how technologies that once seemed revolutionary became ordinary, and how new technologies continue to emerge to challenge what we thought was settled. If you have enjoyed this quiet exploration of Microsoft's history, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps other curious minds find their way here, one sleepy explorer at a time. But for now, let the weight of this history settle gently onto your consciousness. Let the names and dates and strategic pivots fade into memory, becoming abstract patterns that the sleeping mind can work with in dreams. The technology that once occupied room-sized machines now sleeps in your pocket or rests in your home. The software that once required specialized knowledge to operate now adapts itself to human intention. And somewhere in data centers around the world, servers continue their endless computational work, processing requests, serving applications, maintaining the digital infrastructure upon which modern life depends. All of this infrastructure, which once seemed impossible and then seemed inevitable, was built by people, by companies, by choices made under uncertainty. Close your eyes and rest now. Let sleep claim you gently, as the vast mechanisms of the digital world continue their patient work in the background, carrying you and the rest of humanity forward into futures we are only beginning to imagine. Good night.